Hello and welcome to Antinatalism this week. We have got 5 articles lined up, so I'll be keeping the video coverage light today. Just this one in particular that I will be responding to at the very end. So stick around for that. Thomas Malthus, as you may already know, was an 18th century English scholar who studied populations, economics, and human behavior. He is best known for his population principle, the idea that human populations tend to grow faster than the food supply. So, without limits, nature or society will eventually step in with famine, disease, or conflict. Malthus wasn't advocating for disaster. In fact, he preferred what he called preventive checks, things like delaying marriage and having fewer children rather than suffering starvation or epidemics. His ideas have been controversial for over 200 years, inspiring debates about overpopulation, poverty, and even environmental sustainability. His predictions didn't fully play out the way he imagined, but his main point that resources have limits still shape how we think about population today. But that has not stopped him from being a punching bag for pronatalists and also some research institutes accusing him of being some kind of evil person.
He sat down and did some simple math, and summarily decided that the world would be out of food by 1890. He blamed reduced mortality rates, and recommended killing off the have-nots of society, lest the haves starve to death.
Malthus did not recommend anything like this. However, Malthus's predictions about the harmful effects of overpopulation were wrong, and this fact is used as proof that antinatalism is also somehow wrong. On the other hand, antinatalists don't think Malthus was an antinatalist in terms of the ethics of reproduction. After all, Thomas Malthus himself had 3 children, if we are to believe Wikipedia. So, pronatalists view Malthus as evil, and antinatalists think of him as just another economist, not directly related to antinatalism. But what about the other way around? That's the subject of this essay. What would Thomas Malthus think of today's antinatalism and promortalism? Malthus was an impressive and influential thinker of his own time. He was far from being evil, and he meant well for the world. So, seeing that his prediction has gone wrong and that the food supply has not been overgrown by a population of 8 billion people would make him happy. Nothing would make Malthus happier than seeing the large population that the planet currently supports and the relatively high standard of living that so many hundreds of millions of people enjoy. There is no reason to doubt the sincerity of his claim that nothing would give him greater pleasure than to see the obstacles to human perfectibility completely removed, and the extent to which so many barriers to human flourishing have been overcome would almost certainly impress him. But at the same time, as a skeptic regarding human perfectibility, he would be unsurprised to see that war, poverty, injustice, and crime have not been altogether eradicated from society. What about the low birth rates and their negative consequences? Well, he would take seriously the fact that extremely low birth rates are already a significant problem in countries like South Korea, Italy, and Greece, a problem expected to have severe economic consequences. And what about solutions to the problem? There, he would be skeptical of current government policies. He was against monetary incentives to increase populations and would describe them as vicious, cruel, and tyrannical. Malthus would rather increase the demand for agricultural labor by promoting cultivation and with it consequently increase the produce of the country and ameliorate the conditions of the laborer. The essay claims that we don't need to take this literally. In today's world, this translates to the availability of steady employment and of the resources necessary to sustain life as important factors in people's decision whether to have children. What about antinatalism? Here things are a little disappointing. He would also appreciate that many antinatalists are coming from a good place and recognize that in some cases, the act of bringing an additional person into the world can be a harmful one. But notice that this was only in some cases and not in all cases. So, at least as per this essay, he was not an antinatalist in the sense we use the term here. In fact, his willingness to view delayed marriages as a necessary evil should not obscure the fact that he held love and marriage in very high esteem. And his assumption was that most married couples would have children. This makes him look more like a pronatalist, and I think this is good news. One of the go-to tactics that pronatalists use against antinatalism is pointing to Malthus's predictions that didn't come true. But they forget this pronatalist side of him, and once you realize that, their whole argument starts to wobble. Antinatalists, finally, threat to population growth, future is here, is an article in the Nigerian Tribune. This is a big deal because the Nigerian Tribune is a mainstream established media house in Nigeria. The article presents some cases of women who are voluntarily childless for personal or financial reasons, but it also features some ethical antinatalists like Matthew and Daniel who were interviewed on Lawrence's Antinatalism Around the World series, which also gets mentioned in the article. This is also significant for one more reason. Usually, we hear that fertility rates are dropping all over the world except in African countries. And that's largely true, but this article shows that there is a growing awareness, even in African countries like Nigeria, about child freedom and antinatalism. Project Syndicate published an interview with David Benatar by Peter Singer, When Philosophical Misunderstanding Turns Violent. It's a text-based short interview with only 6 questions, but here's a fun fact. At the bottom, where the signature of both Peter and David are mentioned, they both use Peter Singer's photo, much like Peter Singer interviewing himself. Anyway, it is mainly about Guy Bartkus, who bombed a fertility clinic in California a few months ago. That case was a prime example of philosophical misunderstanding turning violent. The interview also talks about how antinatalism is different from pro-mortalism and how one can hold the view of reproductive freedom while at the same time being an antinatalist. So let's say that instead of bombing the fertility clinic, someone just cut off the electricity supply to that clinic. That way, many frozen embryos would be destroyed, but no one would be harmed. Benatar was asked if he would support such an act, to which he said, "While I think bringing children into existence is morally wrong, I also think that there are many good reasons not to interfere with people's reproductive freedom. These include human fallibility, the likely negative consequences of interfering, including the hardening of pronatalist attitudes, and the possibility of failure." MSNBC misrepresented David Benatar's antinatalism in relation to Guy Bartkus's action. Singer gives an analogy from his own work. "I have faced similar misrepresentations. The Animal Liberation Front took its name from my book, Animal Liberation, and many people associated the group with me, even though its members were willing to use violence, which I have always rejected." One interesting quote about absent goods not being bad in Benatar's asymmetry is where he says, "While the absence of goods for existing people is bad, the absence of goods is not bad for a person if the reason why those goods are absent is that the person who would have enjoyed them does not exist." So, a short interview, but one worth keeping. Ian Kidd is an associate professor at the University of Nottingham and is currently writing a book on misanthropy. He recently wrote an article on philosophynow.org titled Weltschmerz and the World. Weltschmerz is a German word that literally means world pain. In this context, it refers to a global sense of world weariness or pessimism. The article explores pessimism across different cultures and historical periods. It begins with Arthur Schopenhauer, the poster child for philosophical pessimism. Schopenhauer saw existence itself as an error, a mistake, and the worst of all possible worlds. He believed that pain, not pleasure, is the positive thing, and that life should disgust us. In his view, humans are trapped in a cycle. We desire, we strive, we get bored, and then we start all over again. The only real escape, the transcendence of the will, something he thought possible only for saints and geniuses. But Kidd reminds us that Schopenhauer was not the only voice in 19th century German pessimism and not always the most influential. Philosophers like Friedrich Beiser, in his book Weltschmerz in 2016, point to a richer network of thinkers, some now largely forgotten, who wrestled with the same core question: is life fundamentally bad for us? Philosophical pessimism, however, is far older than 19th century. In ancient Greece, Sophocles wrote, "Never to have been born is best." Similar doubts about life's value can be found in the works of Montaigne, Rousseau, Hobbes, and even in strands of early Christian theology that stressed humanity's fallen, corrupt nature. For these thinkers, the problem wasn't just bad luck or bad politics. It was something baked into the human condition itself. Outside the German tradition, Kidd highlights Giacomo Leopardi, an Italian poet who thought humanity was necessarily unhappy. Fast forward to 20th century and we find Emil Cioran, the Romanian essayist, who gave us books like The Heights of Despair. Their works don't just lament hardship, they systematically argue that suffering is inevitable, meaning is fragile, and the universe is indifferent. However, pessimism is not just a Western phenomenon. Kidd traces similar themes in Indian philosophy, where some traditions see liberation as an escape from the cycle of birth and suffering. Ancient Indian philosophy was largely pessimistic, with most schools viewing human life as dominated by dukkha, meaning suffering or pain, and escape as unlikely. The Lokayata school was the main exception, promoting materialism and pleasure over spiritual salvation, which is interesting because that was an atheist school of Indian philosophy. The Buddha, like other Indian thinkers of his time, portrayed ordinary human existence as deeply flawed, full of ignorance, craving, and defilements, comparing it to being trapped or bound. While enlightenment offers release, it is extremely rare and demands sacrifices few can make, leaving most people stuck in cycles of suffering. He also predicted moral and spiritual decline over time, with his teachings eventually forgotten and the monastic community corrupted. In Chinese thought, certain Confucian, Taoist, and especially legalist strands take a dim view of human nature. Even in Mesoamerican philosophy, there are expressions of human fragility and impermanence that echo this global tradition of Weltschmerz. Philosophical pessimism is often caricatured as gloominess, but as Kidd stresses, it's not a mood, it's a carefully considered worldview. It asks us to take suffering seriously, to question whether existence is a gift, and to look beyond easy optimism. From Sophocles to Schopenhauer, from Leopardi to Chiron, this tradition offers uncomfortable but profound reminders of our shared vulnerability. Whether you agree or not, the voices of pessimism are part of philosophy's deepest conversations about what it means to live and whether living is worth it. Kidd concludes by stressing the diversity and depth of pessimism. The history of philosophical pessimism is then a global history. It should include ancient Greeks, medieval Christians, the more recent European pessimists, as well as figures and traditions from India, China, and elsewhere. The history should also include Mesoamerican traditions. Pessimism, then, is a global phenomenon. People have approached it through different paths, but they have sought it consistently. A world history of pessimism, while fascinating, would also confirm a disquieting truth. Reflective men and women across cultures with vastly different assumptions and concerns have consistently arrived at pessimistic conclusions about human life. But whether we endorse or challenge those conclusions, there is more to pessimism than the specific Western Weltschmerz of people suffering the death of God. Future human space missions and the procreative ethics between human enhancement and antinatalism is an article by Konrad Schochik. It's a notable piece because it was presented in IEEE's International Symposium. For those unfamiliar, IEEE is the world's largest organization for technology professionals. Anyone who has studied engineering, especially electrical engineering, will recognize IEEE for setting industry standards and fostering collaboration between engineers. In this article, Konrad examines the risks that space exploration poses to future humans and proposes antinatalism as an alternative to such risky endeavors. I wasn't able to read the full article because it was behind a paywall, but it's worth highlighting that space exploration is rarely discussed in the context of antinatalism. It's refreshing to see an article bringing these two topics together. On a channel called Extravaganza Clips, there was a discussion about Amanda Sukhnik's 2023 interview on antinatalism for Soft White Underbelly. Andrew Wilson, a conservative YouTuber who frequently hosts debates and discussions on social media, criticizes Amanda in this video. I'm not going to respond to every single point made, but there are some important parts that need addressing. Let's start with the section where Amanda talks about suffering.
But on the other hand, there's also suffering sometimes motivates us to accomplish things.
That's absolutely true. So once we're alive, we need suffering, right? Like suffering builds character. Mm-hmm. We need to know when we're in pain. Suffering has all of this, can have all of this value. But the fact of the matter is, before we exist, we certainly don't need it. We're certainly not in need of any of that suffering. You know, when there's
Now, Amanda is clear that suffering has some utility once we are alive, but before existence, it is unnecessary. But it doesn't seem like they're paying attention to what she's actually saying.
Have you ever read Camus, Albert Camus?
No.
Any of his work? So he's a 1970s existentialist French philosopher, and he has a book called The Myth of Sisyphus. Right, you know Sisyphus, the old Greek myth of the guy who pushes the rock up the hill, then it comes back down. He's punished by the gods forever.
What'd you say his name was?
Sisyphus.
Sisyphus?
Sisyphus, yeah.
Yes.
I thought it. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm familiar with the legend. Yes.
Yeah. And so Camus' book is all about basically this idea. It's why don't we kill ourselves, essentially? What's actually the meaning to life if we're just going to suffer the whole time? Why don't we just kill ourselves?
This is the level of debate we are dealing with. Amanda was not talking about killing existing beings. In fact, she acknowledged the utility of suffering once life has started. So why bring this argument here? Camus' Sisyphus thought experiment explores meaning in an already existing life. Camus is not arguing for creating a new Sisyphus to push the boulder up the hill. He's asking why an existing Sisyphus should continue to push it. Whether to continue an existing life is a different question from whether to start a new one.
So if we're rational agents, we can also convince ourselves that it's not worth being here as well, right? But seemingly when people are asked, would you prefer to be here and suffer, or would you prefer to not exist? They prefer to exist. Isn't that interesting?
Prefer not to exist is an ambiguous phrase. It could mean preferring to no longer exist or preferring never to have come into existence. People might agree to both simply because they don't make this distinction clearly. Partly because once we are here, we have an existence bias. We tend to see existence as good.
Yeah.
So the rational agent who can convince themselves that they should suffer can also convince themselves that they shouldn't. And it's not like these ideas are not out there in the ethos that people can't go, hey, why do I suffer all the time, right? Why do I have these? And there are people who have such debilitating conditions, right, and are in such agony, which can't be treated, that they do prefer non-existence to the overwhelming amount of pain that they're in. You know what I mean? So people obviously do convince themselves, but it seems like agony and suffering itself is not a thing which convinces people to remove themselves from existence.
They are still fixated on the idea of removing oneself from existence, which is frustrating. This shows that they are not fully engaging with the argument.
And do you think that suffering in and of itself is an inherently bad and negative thing?
No, not in and of itself.
Yeah.
It
Why
can't
not?
be, well, it can't be in and of itself. Because for instance, the idea of you going to a gym, right? That's going to be suffering, right? But there's going to be ends to that, which from the suffering and from the toil, there's these sort of like health outcomes that make the suffering worth it.
Here, Andrew ends up arguing against his own point. The suffering I endure at the gym is a cost I pay for something positive, good health. This shows that suffering is inherently negative. I'm just willing to trade it for a benefit. Then he brings up masochism.
Right.
So in and of itself was that, and by the way, there's a thing that I learned since I started working out again, which is that people actually start to enjoy the process of the suffering. They like being sore. They miss being sore.
Oh yeah.
Right. They're
for
like,
sure.
oh man, I don't feel like my arms are in agony today. And I would really like to reclaim that feeling. So I better go lift some more weights. Right.
Yeah.
So in and of itself, no, suffering can't be evil in and of itself. It has to just always be tied to outcomes. Suffering bad because I don't like it. But if it's good, then it's no longer considered suffering, right? Right. Your suffering is to you is the most agonizing thing ever, but to like a sadomasochist, it's the best thing ever. It's just perspective.
Masochism is a complex topic, but it does not prove that pain is not intrinsically bad. One, for many masochists, certain pain is actually pleasure disguised as pain. Two, in some cases, like soreness after a workout, the underlying badness of pain remains, but an additional layer is experienced as pleasurable. Three, these are rare and usually trivial cases, such as being spanked for sexual pleasure. Even extreme sadomasochists still suffer from other things in life. Have you ever heard of a masochist who enjoys having cancer or undergoing surgery without anesthesia? Serious suffering still produces negative experiences.
So, it's like suffering in and of itself. I don't think is bad.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is why I wanted to play this clip to you today because, you know, as much as it does seem ridiculous on the surface, oh, we should just get rid of population, it's like from the atheist materialist worldview, it's actually not an illogical point of view to be a total antinatalist and to want to wipe out the population of the world. It's actually kind of logical.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you start like this is the fun thing about logic, right? You can start with a kind of a false idea and put it in premise form, and it logically follows, and the conclusion follows from the premises. That doesn't mean, though, that it's true. It doesn't mean that it's true. Even if it's logical, it doesn't mean that it's true.
If I understand them correctly, they are saying that if you are an atheist, meaning you start from the premise that God does not exist, then you must be an antinatalist, and therefore you would want to eliminate the population. Andrew adds that even if this is a logical sequence, it doesn't mean the premise is true. First, it's not logical. We have already seen that being an antinatalist does not mean eliminating existing populations. Second, while atheism may contribute to antinatalism, there are prominent atheists like Matt Dillahunty who oppose antinatalism. Third, even if it were logical, that would not prove atheism. It would only be an implication of atheism. So I'm not sure what point Andrew is making here.
All right, let's carry on.
We exist, there's nobody there, just like they're not in need of all of that suffering that might have some utility to us while we're alive. They also are not in need of any of the good stuff either.
So the argument here is that these people who aren't alive yet can't consent to the suffering that they're going to experience in their life.
That's not the argument that Amanda is making here. Are they just playing any clip of her to score points? She wasn't talking about consent here at all. She was speaking about the absence of any need for good before one comes into existence. What does that have to do with consent? Maybe they mixed up their clips.
So therefore it's unethical to have children.
But they can consent to ending their suffering anytime they want, right?
True.
So how come they don't?
True.
So, then so this goes back to the age-old question, right? You can't consent to existence, but yet you can. What's actually really interesting about this is that the argument is more against her than it is for her. So she says, look, you can't actually consent to being born into a world of suffering. So we have no right to force you into that world, right? That's the basic gist of the argument. But the evidence seems to run against you when it's the case that you were forced into the world and yet still prefer to be here, even though you can take yourself out of it anytime you want. It seems to be making the case that people prefer to be alive than not.
Andrew says most people are happy that they exist, so in a way they're consenting to have been born. He adds that if you think existence is bad, you can always kill yourself and remove yourself from existence. But one, preferring to be alive now is not the same as being glad to have been born. Someone can say, I am not glad I was born, but now that I'm here, I'll continue living. Two, being glad to have been born is not the same as it being better to have been born. Both of these points have been addressed by David Benatar in Better Never to Have Been. As for ending one's life, that's different. Once we exist, we have strong interest in continuing. Ending life is not easy, it involves suffering, and dying is not a simple process. Andrew equates ending an existing life with never starting it. But compare two couples, one remains child-free by choice, the other has a child, and then that child later on ends their own life. Which is better? Not just for the parents or society, but for the child. It's easy to talk casually about this on a podcast, but in reality, it's not easy and involves serious harm.
Definitely, yeah.
Positives, all of it, to have a good life. We're not, before we exist, we're not in need of any of that. And so to create a new being.
Well, so hang on, right here too. There's another thing here to watch for, which is that she's making some suppositions. Right? Before we exist, there's no need for any of this and nobody's suffering. You don't know that. This is just supposed. We actually don't know that. It's possible that everybody who exists is in a void of hell and is being tortured by demons all the time until they finally get through a sluice gate, which then connects your soul with the most recently imbued sperm egg inside of some woman's body. And there you go, right? It could be that it's your great escape from hell and you don't want to go back there. And so that's why you do everything to stay alive on planet Earth. Like these are all just things which are supposed. There's no reason for us to operate off of a supposition that there's no suffering before you're born. There's no reason for us to suppose that, other than she just wants us to take her word for it.
Yes, we don't know whether there are souls floating around begging to be born, or souls enjoying paradise who don't want to be disturbed by being born into a suffering filled world. We can't act on what we don't know. We must act on what we do know. That's why we don't advocate murder. You could speculate that killing someone sends them to heaven, but we don't know that. Unknowns should not guide our moral decisions.
True. Yeah.
That potential sentient being at great risk of a poor quality of life. We do that without consent. Now, I know what you're going to say. It's impossible to get consent of a non-existent being, but that's part of the point. That's the nature of consent. If you can't get consent, then you don't take those risks. You don't impose that harm. I mean, there's been proto-antinatalists.
What if it's the case, though? If I just could give an example of one person, let's say it was a mom who was into witchcraft. She said, I was playing with a Ouija board. And as I was playing with the Ouija board, my daughter communicated through the Ouija board, who didn't exist yet, that she was going to be born next month. Okay. And then that next month, or I was going to get pregnant with her this next month. And that next month I got pregnant with her. And I talked to my daughter years later when she was at the age of rationality, and she remembers this incident of her speaking through the void. That's all she remembers, but gave consent. Does that person then get to exist? No, she would say, wait a second, that's all a figment of your imagination. That never happened, right? There's no way that that's possible. These types of things, right? But there's actually no way. That's the same argument against her, though. There's no way for us to ascertain the possibility of consent either, right? There's no way for us to ascertain that people aren't actually consenting. For all we know, they're all consenting, and we just don't know it.
We don't know either way. And that's the point. No one remembers giving consent before being born, meaning that information is unavailable to us. Being glad to have been born does not count as consent before birth. Whether or not mythical pre-existing beings are consenting is irrelevant. What is relevant is we don't know and we can't know. So we can't act on a speculation while knowing fully about the suffering in this world. Anyway, the rest of the video just sinks into misogyny, personal attacks, and name-calling like psychotic lunatics.
They should be called what they are, psychotic lunatics. Only a psychotic lunatic would want to end all life. Well, you would have to be a psychotic lunatic, right?